Welcome back, students, to another episode of your History Talks, a pre-recorded lecture. I'm Professor Martinez, and this is History Talks. If you remember, History Talks is that pre-recorded lecture I have designed for you to go at your own pace as many times as you need to understand this week's content. And this week's content, as you guys can see on my page, is going to be on British colonies, specifically from 1600s to the 1700s. We've seen the first European contact last week with the Spanish. And out of curiosity, how much of that information as a student was new to you or that you were familiar with last week? But when it comes to American history, it is the British colonies that we will fixate on. And that's what we're going to look at today with this new character to the scene of the continents, a new group that will be arriving to the Americas. Let's look at our objectives for today. Our goals are really just to create an overview and understanding the differences of groups that come from Great Britain to colonize the east coast of North America. So we really are going to be doing an overview of all the claims that the British do in what will be called the British America. And the essential question is going to be, how do you live in a community with diverse backgrounds? You'll find out very quickly that there are different regions or chunks of colonies, all with different motives and all for different reasons for being in now British America. That's what we're going to find and understand today. This is a little bit of the timeline of what those events will look like. We'll talk about the very first settlement and the most mysterious settlement, which is Roanoke Colony. We'll talk about Jamestown. We'll talk about the Mayflower and Plymouth. We'll talk about some of the first conflicts like Bacon's Rebellion, also the Peacock War and King Philip's War, now that we have more tensions between the Native Americans and now the newcomers, that being the British settlers. So, with that being said, let's dive in, shall we? I think the first question many people ask me in my college class is, why does Britain all of a sudden start exploring? This page right here is our explanation. There are essentially 5 different reasons why this is happening. And I'm going to go ahead and capture a lot of them on here, okay? I'm actually going to start on the bottom left-hand corner, where it begins with the age of English naval supremacy. Now, as you remember, the Spanish Empire has been ambitious with its exploration being the first, and it has created some strongholds, not only in the Americas, but also in Europe, as there's been some new ambitions from the Spanish to conquer finally its longest rival being Great Britain. Europeans love to fight, as we know, and this is still the case in this time period too. But the two dominant superpowers is United Kingdom, or New England, and of course also Spanish. So what happens in this part is the Spanish become very ambitious with this newfound power that they have accumulated now in the New World, where they have created a very large naval fleet. This large naval fleet was called the Spanish Armada, and it was meant to be an outright invasion of the island of Great Britain. Well, even with the amount of ships and the scale of it, it was a failed invasion. Many different blunders on the oceans. Essentially, the Spanish Armada was going to be destroyed by the British fleet. And that leaves an opening when it comes to the naval landscape. The Spanish kept many afraid of going into the open waters, but when the Spanish Armada is destroyed, the Spanish are no longer at the peak of their strength. That was that moment. And from there, you'll see the Spanish slowly decline. And with their decline, the increase of presence of both English, Dutch, and French. So that's the first part I like to focus on. Not only did that happen, but we also were poking into the perimeter that the Spanish claimed, which is in the New World. And this is where you saw English privateers giving Britain confidence that it could also go and interact with the New World without being stopped or captured by the Spanish fleets there. So England was weary of engaging in the New World. It was Sir Francis Drake, a pirateer, and other British pirates that staged many different successful raids, showing to the British government that it would be easy to challenge the Spanish sea power in the Americas. So now we know the lane to the New World is open, as far as how Great Britain sees it. But to fund it is another thing, these explorations. And that's where some of these other aspects come from over here. The British mercantilism system is something we need to understand. Simply, we have to understand Britain's island situation. Being an island has some conflicts as a nation. England was very limited on natural resources, and it could only use so much for trade. Trade being the centerpiece of their economy, since they couldn't naturally create and produce everything within that confines of the island. So they relied on overseas territories and trades. So what British mercantilism really means is a belief of a nation's wealth and power that could be maximized by the accumulation of what's considered a commodity globally in global trade. So that would be some like precious metals like silver or gold, and then favorable prices that would go in the global trade to sell those things. That was the way they get their revenue. Along with that, there is some encouragement on the British financial backing to also encourage these explorations. That's because of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I encouraged the dream of expansion. She encouraged her people to step outside of the status quo of their nation, now with her being in charge. So she would provide grants to expeditions, provide funding, ships, and sometimes Marines and soldiers to be able to assist with the navigation towards the Americas. Now, if these explorers, these investors in Great Britain could not get permission from the Queen itself, there is, of course, the private sector that could help with funding. So technically two different avenues of explorers to get their funding. The explorers could go through private sectors where they would do a joint stock company. Joint stock companies is almost similar to like how we see stock markets today. Essentially, people who give their own money to a project, an expedition, a cause, and if the success of that project goes through, because of course of your funding and all the other investors, you get a cut of the profit. Well, there's a lot of these charter companies that hire these ships and these expedition companies to transport people to the Americas. And essentially, people could pool their money together to be able to fund a sea expedition. This allowed a lot of these movements to happen more freely in England, while in Spanish crowned, they required permission from the courts to be able to do so. But why would these people want to leave this lovely island? Like, what's wrong with Great Britain? Well, like I said, it being an island, there is a lot of push factors for why people would want to leave England in this time period. England is kind of a congested nation because of the confines of their island. So you'll see that with the population growth that happened in England in this time period, there's going to be an unemployment rate that actually will correlate with it, where it would also rise as well. The reason why is because there's not enough jobs in the market to be able to continuously give employment to all those who are here. There's a really weird thing with Great Britain when it comes to those who are unemployed or homeless in these circumstances where they can't get a job and can't get land because not everyone can. It leads to stagnation, and Great Britain's methods for solving it are bold. This is where I love to explain the stories of like Australia. Did you not know that Australia was one of the dropping grounds of its undesirables as a way to reduce its population in Great Britain? Essentially, prisoners and unemployed individuals of Great Britain would be sent off to these far, far lands and colonies that Great Britain claimed as a way of populating those and getting rid of the undesirables on their mainland. So this is why we see in Australia a more of a whiter complexion people, where in reality Australia was once an indigenous continent itself. This is where we'll start to see the same case for who we send to the New World first. as another way to exhaust some of the people that are considered the excess or undesirables of this time period. So that's a push factor for why people are going to be pushed out of the island towards all these new opportunities. All of these things I just mentioned here are the reasons why Great Britain and its empire will now look more towards the Western Hemisphere to see what are the opportunities now that they're obtainable. Here's some other incentives for more English settlements. Of course, monetary incentives is one of the biggest ones. At least we saw that to be the case when it came to Spanish rule, right? Remember, when it came to the Spanish, their three motives were the three G's: God, glory, and gold, right? When it comes to the English, they don't really care about the God part, far as trying to convert others. For them, it's going to be more about the glory and gold, right? To expand territory and to continue with the sense of gathering gold as a form of money, right? So with this, you're going to see a big competition between European nations, almost like a race for these new lands that are being discovered, with more people being bold enough to be able to claim these territories. So this, in a sense, if you know the word imperialism, is like a precursor to imperialism. These rat races among these nations, particularly these European nations, to try to grab as much land as possible before the other European nations do so that they compete with. But when it comes to the God aspect, there's a difference when it comes to the English versus the Spanish. And you got to know this, all right? When it comes to the English, their religious incentives is not to convert more people to their clergy or to their groups. For them, it's rather to have this sense of religious freedom. And what I mean by this is there's a lot of religious turmoil within England. This is all going to be because of Church of England that was created by King Henry VIII, where he split the Catholic Church. If you don't know that story, it's this European story of essentially a king who wanted to divorce his wife. His wife could not produce an heir. He was upset, so he wanted to divorce. He asked the Pope if he may do so. The Pope says, that's not what we do in our religion. So King Henry was not okay with that answer, so he said, fine, I'll just create my own church, and oh look, this church does allow divorces. In that entire personal conflict that is the king's, he then makes it the problem of the nation, as he creates turmoil and a little bit of conflict and division among his citizens. Because remember, back then, a king was the one who made the calls on religion. He had the divine right. So him being the divine right of God dictated what was the religion of his people. And the people would have to confine and adopt the religion of the king or be persecuted for not doing so. And this is where we get the groups of English settlers that we have come to the New World. You'll see there's a group called like Puritans. Puritans are people who want to purify the Angelical Church. They want to still stay a part of this Church of England, but they want to make it true to what is the belief of their religion. They want to be pure in its actions as a Christian community. Then, of course, you have separatists. Separatists in all of these conflicts want to absolutely break away from England and its religion and its laws and persecutions. Because for separatists, for years, they were imprisoned and even at times executed for defying the government and the Church of England. So separatists really did find themselves in a position of being mostly pushed out and ostracized from England. While Puritans were still within the confines of the in circles of what was English religious groups. Those separatists, we don't call them separatists in our stories. We call those separatists pilgrims. And we know the words of pilgrims. We've heard the stories of pilgrims as we were children. And today we'll kind of see what is the difference between what we're told and what we know with that. So this is the incentives that we need to understand when it comes to English settlement. But you're going to see me talk about these English settlements now in 3 different chunks. Matter of fact, if you're looking at my map right here, you're going to notice that there are a few different chunks and regions. And in these three different chunks of regions, we are going to label them the Southern Colonies, the Middle Colonies, and the New England Colonies. I'm going to start kind of chronologically, and I'm going to start with the Southern Colonies first, with our understanding of the very first attempted settlements by the English. So just so you understand where we're headed, let's go ahead and talk about those Southern Colonies. We're going to start with the very first attempt. The very first attempt of English colonies and English settlements is going to happen in 1787 by Sir Walter Raleigh. And this is going to be where Sir Walter will be trying to establish the Roanoke colony. The Roanoke colony was the first charter that was given permission to be able to explore the New World. Now, they arrive to this spot. As you can see on my map right here, the Roanoke is on this little island on the tip of these peninsula and islands in North Carolina. This is where you're going to see about 91 men, 17 women, and 9 children settle this areas. Now, the way the story goes is once they're there, they start to establish their settlement. But very soon, the settlement needs more supplies and reinforcements to keep the liveliness of the settlement going. Now, John White is kind of unique for the fact that his wife will give birth to the very first white American settler, who is Virginia Dare. This is the first recorded birth that happened in America from a foreign-born who will become the Americans. But he finds out very quickly that his people need supplies. So John White is sent back to England to go ahead and get supplies. It was not meant to be a long time that he was supposed to be gone. But because of the hostilities of Spain, he couldn't return back to the colony until 3 years after he left. When he arrives back, he gets back to the island and finds no one. Nothing. Everything's gone. Everyone's gone. There is no evidence that it would explain what happened in this area. No signs of violence or any hints. There's only one clue. And that one clue was left carved on a tree. And it said Croatoan. Now, for John White and for much of history, the word Croatoan meant nothing. It was just gibberish on a tree. Nothing for him to really work with. Now, what we know with a neighboring indigenous language, the word Croatoan actually means council town, which still doesn't give much of understanding what happened in the area. Now, many historians have theorized on this mystery. Some would say some of the obvious choices. Maybe this colony was wiped out. Maybe it was wiped out because of a natural disaster, or wiped out by themselves, or wiped out by the neighboring tribes. Some of the neighboring tribes said they didn't really have an understanding of what happened to them. And then, of course, there's the other story, which is the fact that there may have been a squabble between the Native Americans and the settlers that led to then violence. Or maybe the Native Americans let the settlers be a part of their society and adopted them within it. We really don't know what happened. But what we do know is that the first English settlement is an absolute failure. John White is struck by the failed settlement, the loss of his family, soon to have a very sad story of his own when reporting back to the English. That was the first attempt. It was a failure, a mystery that we still just don't know. Then we're going to see there are more charters that will come out of the woodworks in England to try to continue to promote, especially with new authorities in England like King James I, who will issue a charter for the Virginia Company to explore the Chesapeake Bay. This is where we're going to see more adventurers and especially two groups of merchants who were determined to start establishing more lands within these areas. And some of these other charters are going to be like London and Plymouth, the Virginia Company, that will eventually come out later in our stories that come from these charter being issued. But what was considered technically the first real settlement attempt, the one that actually holds on, is the story of Jamestown in 1607. Now, we've heard of Jamestown in our stories in early American history. we're going to now understand the experiences of Jamestown and how it was for these first settlers. Now, these settlers are from those merchant charter companies. So their mission really is centered on creating an established settlement and finding how to make it profitable. When they arrive, they are in the worst conditions. Multiple different tragedies happen, many different circumstances, but really what happens to a lot of these first settlements is they struggle within the very first winter. And that's absolutely the case for Jamestown. They went through something as they called the starving time. Starving time happened from 1610 to 1611, where essentially they were running out of resources, were incapable of cropping, had a struggle within the New World that led to them slowly dwindling. Out of the 500 settlers that went, 60 of them will remain after the starving time. It really is a dark time for them. This is where there's no food, and this will then result to settlers being so desperate of either eating their leather boots, eating dead horses, or dead people. Cannibalism was their last resort. That was how low things were. It really wasn't until a shakedown in the colony that really kind of got them out of this despair that they were kind of going through. And this is where you hear the story of Captain John Smith organize the colony, where he starts to saying, "He who will not work will not eat," to kind of push progress on this colony past its despair. It really wasn't until the neighboring indigenous who helped these colonists that really helped them survive. This is where you hear the stories of the indigenous trying to work with the settlers and able to help them survive and build some kind of relationship. This is where they're sharing agriculture knowledge and technology that they know of the land. This is where you will probably hear the stories of Pocahontas and all these other aspects that we've heard, which the ways in which that Disney story tells is not accurate to the way it is. But really what happens in Jamestown that is significant isn't the story of Pocahontas, but it is what they learn from the indigenous as a way to keep their colony alive. And that is when they learn how to cure tobacco. Tobacco is one of the commodities the natives showed, a commodity that was not known in the New World until this moment. And if you know, tobacco is the number one crop that is sold for profit for these settlers. And when it comes to this story, you'll hear John Ralph, who taught his wife to be one of the first to cure the tobacco in the colonies. And essentially the tobacco saved the colonies from their despair. And there was a saying that the colonies were built on smoke, as this was the thing that got them out of their starving times and the destruction of their settlement. And it paved the way for something else that will start here but not end for a long time. And that is plantation society. In the South, we know there are many plantation societies, and this is the moment they are born. And with their birth, there is consequences and impacts to the trajectory of early American history, hinting and rumoring towards the Civil War. Before I talk more about that impact, let's answer this question before we continue. From what you've heard from those other two slides, why did the English start exploring the New World? What was the thinking? What was the mission? Answer that before we continue. Perfect. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and move on. So, if you're looking at my title, you'll notice that I will kind of give you the basic rundown of what are the things that each of the colonies are focused on. And that part is important to take notes on. Of course, those things that are bolded are also very important to take notes on too. Now, when it comes to the South, they're going to be focused on economics, politics, and high class. When it comes to tobacco, this is where the economy, the high class, and the politics are built on. The emergence of tobacco economy led to an increase of demand of land for crops and labor to sustain the settlements. Now, that expansion will lead to more conflicts and tensions with neighboring native tribes. The last time we talked to natives, they have gone through a huge reduction in their population. The diseases that are introduced by these new settlements is wiping out the populations. So the strength of these native tribes are now dwindled to the point where they don't see the option of violence being a way of getting rid of these settlements. They're not at that strength anymore. So you're going to see a little bit more of collaboration and negotiations between these two. But it's tobacco and the taste and demand for more land that will push this compromising aspects of tribes to the limit back to conflict. We'll get to there in a moment. But just know that tobacco creates a demand. Demand not only for land, but of course, labor. Tobacco is a very exhaustive crop to create. It is actually a struggle, just like cotton. And when it exhausted the land, it forced colonists to also have to consider what will be the source of labor. Now, I know we quickly jumped to slavery being the conversation for the labor, but believe it or not, it wasn't them that was the first labor force that these British American colonies first considered. It was actually indentured servants. Now, if you don't know what indentured servants are, indentured servants were typically other fellow British Americans who were conscripted into servitude. They would typically do this either because they were a criminal, or they would do this as a sense of financial benefit at the end. To be an indentured servant, you are signed up to then be the labor force for someone who is your like overseer or boss of that time period. As an indentured servant, there are certain lines of rights they have in comparable to slavery. And when they are done with their time, there's also a sense of entitlement for these indentured servants who are expecting freedom, social ladder movement, and for prosperity and opportunity. So now with the demand for indentured servants, you're going to start to see a funneling of those, once again, undesirable population from England being brought to the New World. And when people are paying for the passage to have white indentured servants be used in the colonies, they are receiving land themselves, and the servants after their time will receive land at the end of their servitude. So it's kind of like this like win-win for the boss man to be able to take these white indentures as a labor force and get more land by doing so, and indentured servants giving their time temporarily and then being out of the indentured servant and then being a landowner. That is the compromise that is made between these two different groups in England. Now, this will naturally attract many new settlers to the colonies, and this will grow the populations of the settlements. It's also some other commodities we need to recognize that the settlers use that keeps their survival. It's not just the cash crop of tobacco, but it's also corn that is considered a great yield producer, and it was easy for these people to cultivate now that they were taught by the natives how to use it. Overall, Jamestown will struggle for decades as a small settlement, and it's not until the Crown that will revoke the company charter and it be under the control of the Crown that you'll start to see the Jamestown story kind of evolve more and more and more. But it really is the cash crop, the labor, and the evolution of that labor that will change. And that evolution of labor is something we'll talk about in this class. This is with the story of how slavery begins in this nation under the British American system. You'll see very quickly these indentured servant system is not considered an efficient system. One, the indentured servants are not considered effective workers, nor are they able to sustain against the disease and the climate in this new land that they're unfamiliar working with. This then later made the settlers consider other sources of labor. They then considered having native slaves, but native slaves were also ineffective workers and were too defiant. It is hard for one to enslave somebody on their own homeland, if you will. The outright defiance, runawaying, or just native suicides would lead to these people being not and exploited as labor force because they wouldn't let themselves be. This is where eventually you'll start to see the introduction of another labor force that may be better in their eyes compared to natives and indentured servants. And that, of course, is African slavery. Now, African slavery is going to be where we start to see the growth of that being the main source. It's in 1619 where the first Africans do arrive. These first Africans are the ones who will be the first labor force to help the settlements. And the first slave was actually a slave woman. And many of these slaves, as we know, are brought against their will in Africa. There's this system that's being created, this new economy that's being created, that is starting between the New World, Old World, and Africa, now that we're starting to see these markets be created. What I mean by that is essentially this image. Now that we see this economy being built, you're going to see this vicious cycle be created. You see the New World over here, who are extracting all of these new raw goods that come from the Americas and bringing those raw goods to the Old World. The Old World will then utilize these new goods and commodities, turn them into manufactured goods, and then sell those manufactured goods to the new settlements and markets there, or would also sell these new manufactured goods and trade them within the African slave lords in the coast. There, you'll see the exchange of either rum, textiles, and whatnot, where we will trade with those African lords in the name of having African slaves. This is called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is then the labor force being sent into the Caribbean or into the Americas at exchange with the Caribbean slave trade versus the American slave trade. And in exchange, you'll see a push of livestock, grains, and constant commodities created, as now the New World has more of a labor force to then extract more of the raw goods in replacement of more manufactured materials in the name of more slaves to produce more. You see this cycle created. This cycle that, of course, is at the benefit of some and at the expense of many. We'll talk much more about this as time goes by. But let's talk more about some of the Southern settlement issues. We already talked about the economics, but now we need to talk about politics and a little bit more of class system. There is another circumstance that happens in these Southern settlements. Now that you see the rise of these plantations, you're going to start to see a rise of what we'll call plantation aristocrats. Plantation aristocrats are these plantation owners who are at the tippity top of the benefit of that economy I just showed you. Those people are eventually going to have a conflict in this event that's called the Bacon's Rebellion against those indentured servants. Now, we're talking about a settlement in Virginia of Jamestown. Essentially, the story goes is that the east side is where the plantation owners and those of power were in a part of the region that had the best land with the least amount of indigenous conflicts. The west side was given to those indentured servants and to poor farmers. The west side had less fertile land and had a strong native conflict presence in that area. Eventually, the freedmen being the former indentured servants, did not receive the land grants or protection from the governor of the time period named Berkeley. And not receiving their land grants meant they were not receiving their part of the deal of their servitude. And on top of that, they were dealing with lots of conflict with no protection from the settlement really against those native attacks. The native attacks were constant and a nuance on the west side of the Virginia colony, but once again, Governor Berkeley did nothing about it. It isn't until this man named Nathaniel Bacon, an aristocrat in the west, who starts to build up a population of these indentured servants to rise up and to start speaking of the social disparity between the have and have-nots in this story, and essentially saying the indentured servants were entitled to their land and protection from the local authority. So Nathaniel Bacon puts this into his own hands. He gets a militia assembled of these west settlers, and they start to protect white settlements from the native attacks. They succeed pushing back some of the native attacks It was then when Berkeley was to have Bacon and his militia arrested for being an unauthorized assembly. This is then when Bacon was furious and later turned his actions of his militia towards the Jamestown itself. This is where Bacon and the rebels will burn down Jamestown and chase out Berkeley for being someone who was not resolving the social disparities or the native attacks. Now, eventually, Nathaniel Bacon will fall ill and die from diseases, and the rebellion will be crushed. But there is the significance of this story that is what matters for then the change in early American history. The importance of the story is that the plantation owners saw very quickly that it was more difficult to control the white indentured servants. The white indentured servants were full of entitlement and rights and were not effective enough for what was the economy that they were trying to create. So they are now going to double down their faith on that other source of slave labor that is coming in. African slavery will be then considered the preferred labor versus what was the original one, being indentured servants. And this is the beginning of what we'll call racial slavery. Racial slavery is different than other slavery that has existed in human history. And we'll talk much more about this in the future. But this is the moment it is born as a justification for why this group versus another group. Before we continue with the stories, I got a checkpoint for you. What were the South colonies focused on in North America? We're going to say goodbye to the South very soon as more colonies will start to populate in these areas, Jamestown being one of the most important. But what were they focused on entirely? Answer that question for me. Thank you. All right, let's move on, shall we? We're now going to talk about the northern settlements. The northern settlements is not going to be these merchants and charter companies that were there for the sense of profit, but more in the sense of religious incentives. And this is going to be those pilgrims that we've mentioned in the past. Now, the north is going to be more focused on government structure, religion, and natives. When we talk pilgrims, we're going to go to New England. And New England is going to be us talking about the Plymouth colony and a little bit about the Massachusetts Bay colony, all in Massachusetts area. That is going to be the area we're talking about. And this is where we'll hear the common stories that were told in America about the Mayflower ship, a group of pilgrims who leave New England for the sake of religious freedom to practice their religion without persecution. The Mayflower ship will hold 102 people. What is also kind of unique about the Mayflower ship is the Mayflower Compact that was made right before they land in Plymouth colony. And the Mayflower Compact is considered one of these very first civil government documents that are created in our country, which is a set of agreements among the settlers where they have a set of rules that they are going to collectively work together and have a systems of voting and collaboration among the community. And it's considered kind of important for the first civil document. And it also is legitimizing claim of the settlement so that it's verified by the English government back then. This is where they're going to land on Plymouth Rock and they're going to take over an abandoned native village. This is one of those places where the East Coast natives were impacted by diseases that led to a huge depopulation in the area, where by the moment these pilgrims come, they really only see scattered populations of Native Americans, where at one point this was congested areas of natives. But because of disease, it feels sparse. It feels almost like as if it was virgin land that was not being utilized from the many who were once there before. Just like Jamestown, the Plymouth colony will also have a really bad first year, especially the first winter, where half of the pilgrims will die, but none of them will leave. Some Jamestown people will leave, but for the pilgrims, they kind of lock in on this colony and this place. They don't let it go. And as they recover, it is because of the local neighboring indigenous, just how we saw in Jamestown, where you'll see some of these tribes will come and compromise, trade, and work with these new settlers in teaching them the way of the land. This is where we'll hear some classic stories, Thanksgiving between the Wangapogs and these settlers who have a moment of getting along as they build this alliance that leads to some peace for some time. That peace will eventually dwindle. And the reason why is, once again, the impacts that pilgrims and settlers have on the areas. What I mean is these settlers also bring smallpox. These smallpox also devastate these local natives. The settlers will have now a demand for fur, animal skin, and meat, which will deplete the wild animals in the area that the natives depend on. So now kind of impacting their wellness and impacting their wellness within this region. And then it is also that the settlers brought old world livestock, such as horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs. And all of these animals impact the ecosystems within this area, and now impacting more of the natives' land and crops as these animals are eating it and destroying it and changing the landscape where these natives have been. Now, Plymouth remained a poor community that did not extend as much compared to the other British settlements. And they were really proud of their struggle, the Pilgrims, because they thought they were really creating a Christian community away from persecution that was more true to the way in which they should live. So for them, they're going to be kind of fixated in this spot, but still impacting these natives in different kinds of ways. Eventually, the Pilgrims will merge into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Plymouth itself won't be necessarily recognized within as an independent, but more merged into some other colonies later on. This is eventually where the Great Migration of 1630 will happen, when 2,000 colonists will continue to arrive to Boston as further turmoil in England leads to more being pushed out towards the west. So that's the story of our Pilgrims. There's another group of people we do need to talk about who also exist in the North. Another religious group. This group is not the Pilgrims, but rather the Puritans. Now, Puritans also faced a lot of push factors in England. They eventually became a target in an English Civil War that then led to these Pilgrims wanting to find a safe haven from the political and social turmoil. But what makes them unique compared to those Pilgrims is they're still associated with the Church of England. They have not broken off. They just want to create a pure community that represents their religion. This is when, in 1630, they will set sail from New England and become the largest migration to the Americas in this time period, with over 1,000 settlers coming to the New World. This is where we get another famous character that comes out in our stories. This is John Winthrop, who was a famous and successful governor who helped create one of the first colonial governments. Colonial governments are the first precursors before the British Crown will absorb the government authorities in these areas. And John Winthrop is known for kind of creating the first town hall meetings that are like the first staples of democracy, allowing people to have more voice. And then, of course, with that, there's also going to be the famous saying that John Winthrop had, which was to create this community as it will be a city upon a hill. An idea of being a model, an example of how society should be in a perfect world. That's what his hopes are with this land. Now, with Puritans, they also brought a lot of the religious and ideological conflicts that came from England, which eventually would lead to then some changes within Puritan settlements, while some Puritans who follow the faith were given more social class power and political power, and those who were considered less religious or less of following the purity of the community were eventually meant to leave the settlement and establish their own settlements, which will eventually create the Rhode Island colonies that were then considered more religiously tolerant and more natively tolerant versus the Puritans themselves. So there's going to be more clusters of settlements that come out depending on the verity of your purity into the Puritan religion. You're going to see that there's going to be some challenges with these Puritans, and it's not always going to be when it comes to the sense of natives, but rather some social conflicts within them. This is where we get another classic story, which is the Anne Hutchinson story. If you don't know, Anne Hutchinson is like the first American feminist, if you will. It is this woman who starts to condemn this religious political system where some clergy members were given more power versus others, as she called out some of them for not being actually elected, but rather just given these powerful positions because of their religious clout or because of social clout. Not only was she questioning the authority of the clergy system among these Puritans, but she also started questioning the role of women in Puritan societies. Really showing the contradictions of their community. She's going to be pushing for the sense of equal representation of women within society and within religion groups, as some women were not allowed to be associated within the religious powers. So many women in these communities will start to follow Anne Hutchinson on this campaign that will then eventually lead to a target on Anne Hutchinson by these clergymen who will then deem her unfit for society, therefore banished from Puritan society. Eventually, Anne Hutchinson will be one of these people who will then go to Rhode Island, the other colonies in these areas that were considered more welcoming to those who were banned and not allowed into these communities. Then she'll eventually find herself in New Netherlands, which is a Dutch colony, where eventually she will die in a native uprising. But she was the first push and call about women's rights in these communities that were being built, but was pushing for them within religiously conservative groups. And that's the story of Anne Hutchinson for us. But like I mentioned, it's not just that social disputes that is the only thing these North settlements deal with. What I mean is there's a lot of native threats that are happening in the North. Natives, like I mentioned, are more cooperative with the settlers, and they helped the Puritans with their knowledge of the land. In exchange, they would also benefit from some of the trades they would do with the Old World by obtaining some Old World materials themselves, like guns and horses and iron material. Natives soon, though, will see these settlers more as a threat, though, for the same reasons almost as I mentioned in the past with the South. White settlers kept going deeper into native lands to help their expansion of their agrarian economy. If you don't know what agrarian economy means, that's essentially creating that wide-scale single crop land of farm that we see today. It's also talking about raising livestock and animals and domesticated animals for food and trade. So these are actual issues for Native American societies because the further expansion of these crops means less land for Native Americans and wild land that they can utilize. And also the livestock would run wild and destroy native crops as there was no respect between these two communities in the sense of creating these rules between them. Like I mentioned, wild animals began to disappear from overhunting, and these were resources natives depended on, and the constant exposure to diseases really weakened these tribes as they recognized that this is an exposure to these new incumbers that leads to their demise. Puritans, though, they also started to see Native Americans as less of an essential trade partner and more as heathens and savages, as they see them as a constant threat to their godly community. This is when they're going to start changing their perspectives of what these indigenous should be to them, as they start to consider maybe converting natives to Christianity to Christianize them or civilize them, or to simply exterminate and to commit genocide in the sense of them being the only one benefiting from this land. You have to understand that there was more than 100,000 natives in New England at the beginning of the 17th century. But by 1675, only 10,000 will really remained. The natives' decline led to despair among the New England tribes. It drove some natives to alcoholism. it had led to natives having conversations about converting to Christianity so they may be admitted into these praying towns, designed for Native Americans who converted to Christianity and were allowed to live in these specifically designed towns where they were to pick up the lifestyle and traditions and cultures of the Puritans. And it led to others resorting to war as a way in which of trying to bring back their communities from this despair and decline. And this is where we start to get the bigger conflicts with Native Americans. This is the Pequot War and the King Philip's War. Now, the Pequot War is technically the very first large-scale war between settlers and a Native American tribe. This is going to be happening in Connecticut, where the Connecticut settlers were competing with the neighboring tribe, being the Pequots, over a competition of land and also trade with the Dutch, who are in the New Netherlands, which we'll talk about in a bit. In this competition, it leads to tension and conflict that will then eventually lead to these Puritans who will do a outright war towards the Native Americans. Now, Native Americans weren't familiar with the way in which warfare was done with Europeans. Now, these Puritans are going to be a collection of different Puritans from different Puritan towns, and it's also going to be a collection of Native Americans that they have built an alliance with, like particularly the Mohawks, who were against the Pequots. So turning some Native American tribes against other Native American tribes that were typically rivals, and this would lead to the Pequots losing. Now, like I mentioned, the Native Americans weren't familiar with how British people fight. And the way they fought was eye-opening to a lot of these Native Americans. Essentially, the end of this battlings between these two will end with the Pequot village being burned and destroyed. This will eventually result with the settlers surrounding the Pequot village and burning the village and the people inside as they do a full-scale war against those people. This is when you see not only men, but women and children also brutally killed. For indigenous, warfare is a thing. It's been a thing. But indigenous don't do outright warfare in this sense. Typically, they would defeat the men, and then either capture the men, demand tribute from those people, or they will enslave some of those people. But they would never outright kill all of the village and kill all children and women in this circumstance. So this is eye-opening for many indigenous people when they see the scale of which settlers are willing to go into securing their land that they want. So at the end of the slaying of the Pequot village, you'll see many of the captured Pequots being sold to the West Indies as slaves. And that's the Pequot War for us. Before we leave it, I do want you guys to watch this video that kind of goes a little bit more into it.
As the Puritans of New England expanded into
the relationship between these settlers and indigenous is really now being strained and stained with more violence. And it's now the next war that puts it on the next level. That is King Philip's War. Now, King Philip's War is going to be an outright war by a collection of Eastern indigenous tribes. In 1670, Chief Metacomet, a chief that the white settlers will refer to as King Philip, convinced this alliance of New England tribes to attack and outright expel the white settlers from their land. Them seeing that they have one last moment to do a full-scale attack in the name of trying to remove the settlers is an attempt that these tribes will try to do. They know that they're at a decline with disease, and this is the last moment they see of trying to solve their problems. And they do it through, of course, violence. And this is where you're going to see 52 out of 90 Puritan towns be attacked. It's a full-scale war, constant attacks as they try to expel these indigenous. Now, the assault looks successful in the beginning. It looks like the indigenous are going to succeed with eliminating the Puritan towns in this area. But it was then the counter-reaction of these settlers that pushed away this what if into alternative history. It is the New England Confederation in 1643 that led to the loss of the indigenous tribes in this campaign. And the Confederation aimed to defend against natives, French, and the Dutch as they tried to create this colonial unity among Puritan towns and some native alliances they created. Essentially, it was this moment among Puritans when they had a conversation of saying that if we do not band together, we lose altogether. And this is the first colonial unity that we see among these settlers where they band together for a cause. You'll see this theme play out yet again when it comes to the American Revolution. But this is the first moment that you'll see them band together for a cause, regardless of the differences that they may have. And that confederation is the one that would be tested and then win in the King Philip's War. Before we talk more about the results from the King Philip's War, I want you guys to watch this video that kind of captures the significance and importance of it within our early American history. Perfect. Thank you for watching that. And just to reflect on that importance yet again, there are some 3 clear things that come out of this war. It is considered one of the bloodiest wars that have ever happened in New England, but it leads to the settlers being in a position of dominance after it. This was the last big push from the Eastern Native American tribes. After this moment, they will be in a position of further decline where they will no longer be in a position to do anything about the settlers. The settlers in a position of dominance because of the now bigger populations they will have and the technology they utilize to defeat these natives. And third, has an importance, it really is the forever stain of the relationship between Native Americans and settlers, as the stories that are told here after the brutality of these wars will lead to the narratives and stories that are told to the future settlers on how the end results of the relationships between natives will be, and that see the natives as rather as savage, barbaric individuals rather than another group of people that can be reasoned with. It is that will forever create the trajectory of the relationship between further settlers and natives, as they will no longer have a moment of cooperation, but see both as a fixated issue of barbarity and savagery from one another. That is the significance of the King Philip's War. And with that, I would love for us to now summarize the northern colonies with this question. How were the northern colonies different than the southern colonies? What were those things they dealt with? What were some of those significance? Answer that for me before we continue. Thank you. There's only one small region left that we need to merely recognize, but honestly, I don't heavily test on it. It really is the northern and southerner colonies that you'll really need to worry about. Here, we're just going to merely recognize some developments and also the middle colonies that exist. Now, when I refer to middle colonies, if you're looking at my picture, it's that green area of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. This is kind of a wedge within the English colonies that are both northern and southern, as in this time, it is not the English who own it, but rather the Dutch, another competing European empire who is trying to make claim in America. It won't last long, though, as you can see on my notes here. Matter of fact, some of these Puritans will have a war with the Dutch that will result into New York being captured from the Dutch, and now New York becomes another British colony. You'll start to see another religious group being introduced. While I don't recognize them greatly in these episodes, you'll see them matter a lot more in the Civil War, and that, of course, is the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Quakers is another religious group that is created by another famous settler named William Penn, where you'll see Quakers be known for their pacifism, their egalitarianism, and their emphasis on social justice. They're the religious group that really follows their religion to the T. And that means that they do not do violence, they do not believe in slavery, and they believe in religious tolerance, Native American rights, and all of these other things that leads to more of a civility within all of these settlements. Within those southern colonies, you'll eventually see some changes that will happen. That's after a long stagnation after the English Civil War, where eventually you'll start to see more colonies be planted in this area, like, for example, the Carolinas. The Carolinas are going to be mimicking the Caribbean economy. The Caribbean economy is where we see those sugar and rice plantations that are ran by slavery plantations. They're going to be adopting a lot of those different economies within these southern regions, which will kind of create the southern societies that we see even further. And then eventually Georgia will be secured by Great Britain, more of a stronghold fort area as a way to be a buffer against the Spanish control that is building up in Florida. It eventually becomes a safe haven for those who aren't in these other communities. This is the middle grounds I refer to. It's really an area where there wasn't a huge dominance of one European group versus another, and also the natives didn't have a clear dominance. It's kind of like a middle ground between all of it. Like I said, you're not tested on this one, but you just had to recognize where this region came from and just its developments overall. So, what are those middle colonies? What do we call it, the middle colonies? That's the basics I'm just going to ask you out of this checkpoint so that you now know the whole landscape of the Eastern colonies. Perfect. Thank you. And congratulations, folks. That is the end of our episode. This was an episode merely just recognizing the overview of the different diverse groups of now the British colonies that come to the New World, with the conflicts and tensions they had to deal with in the development of these new colonies. But now we have set the stage of what is that beginning early American history with the European group that we do descend from and eventually break off of when we become our own nation. That's the end of this episode, folks. Thank you so much for going through it, and I hope you guys learned something new. But until next time, I'm Professor Martinez, and this was History Talks. Thank you.